At the will reading, the air was heavy, charged with the kind of silence that makes every tick of the clock feel louder. Relatives shifted in their chairs, eyes darting between the lawyer's poised hands and the unopened folder that held my father's final words. My sister, dressed in a shade of arrogance she'd worn her entire life, leaned in close. Her lips barely moved, but her words carved through me like glass. "You were never the daughter he loved." The lawyer's voice faltered, caught mid-sentence, his gaze flickering toward me as if he, too, felt the cruelty of that whisper. My chest tightened, not because her words were new, but because they confirmed every unspoken wound that had lingered in the shadows of my childhood. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The room seemed to still, the chandelier above, the polished wood beneath our feet, even the portraits on the wall, as if the house itself had stopped to witness what had just been said. What she didn't realize in her moment of smugness was that this whisper, this poisonous little triumph, would be the very spark that burned down her carefully constructed world. The silence wasn't just silence, it was the sound of karma waiting its turn. She thought she had delivered the final blow, but the truth was crouched and ready to strike, and it would not spare her. Before I reveal how her arrogance shattered in front of everyone, do me a favor, hit that hype button right below this video. It's like a super like, you only get 3 each week, so when you use one here, you're helping push this story higher so more people can see it. And while you're here, tap like and subscribe, because what comes next will leave you stunned. I am in my mid-40s now, but for most of my life, I carried the role of the invisible daughter. People often say that in every family there is a golden child and a shadow. My sister shined so brightly in my parents' eyes that there was no room left for me. She was always the celebrated one, the star at every recital, the favorite at every holiday, the one whose mistakes were forgiven before they even landed. And me? I was the one who blended into the background, who worked twice as hard only to be met with silence, whose victories were treated as accidents rather than achievements. I still remember my 12th birthday. All I wanted was a simple cake with my name on it, nothing fancy, just acknowledgement that I existed too. That night, my sister came out holding a 3-tiered cake covered in sparklers while relatives clapped and cheered. When my turn came, a half-melted store-bought cake was placed in front of me with no candles, no song, and no photo to remember it by. I smiled anyway, because I had already learned to expect less. Vacations were no different. My parents once planned a trip to Europe. Bags were packed, tickets were booked, and my excitement was unbearable. The night before, I overheard the hushed conversation. There wasn't enough money for everyone, so I was told I'd be staying with an aunt just this once. I waved goodbye at the airport while watching my sister hold the passport and camera, her face glowing in snapshots that would later fill our living room walls. I was erased not just from the trip, but from the memories themselves. Even in adulthood, the pattern repeated. I took on jobs my sister refused, helped cover bills she ran away from, and stepped in for responsibilities no one else wanted. When my father grew ill, I was the one who cooked his meals, cleaned his space, and sat by his bed reading aloud so he wouldn't feel alone. But when visitors arrived, my sister would sweep in for 5 minutes, smile, and suddenly she was praised as the dutiful daughter. I never corrected them. I swallowed the pain because fighting for recognition in that house was like shouting into the wind. Those years shaped me into someone resilient, hardworking, and fiercely protective of my own children. I wanted them to know a different kind of love, the love I rarely received. And yet, the ghost of being overlooked followed me everywhere. Each small rejection chipped at me, each forgotten moment stitched a quiet scar. By the time my father passed, I thought I had made peace with it. But the truth is, I hadn't. That lifetime of dismissal was sitting inside me, waiting, and when my sister whispered those cruel words at the will reading, it was as though every scar reopened at once. But here's the thing, when you've spent your whole life in the shadows, you learn how to survive in silence. And when the moment finally comes to step into the light, you are stronger than anyone expects. The house I grew up in was not just a home, it was a monument. A sprawling estate with gates that groaned open like the entrance to another world, gardens trimmed within an inch of their lives, and hallways that echoed with footsteps long after you had passed. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, each frame glinting under heavy chandeliers, their stern faces staring down as if judging who among us was worthy of carrying the family name. To visitors, it looked like wealth, stability, and pride. But to me, it felt like a museum where I was nothing more than a forgotten exhibit, gathering dust in the corners. At the center of this cold grandeur stood my sister, the golden child. She was everything the family liked to display, glamorous, perfectly dressed, with a smile that looked painted on but convinced everyone in the room. From an early age, she learned how to twist admiration into entitlement. If she wanted something, she got it. If she broke something, someone else was blamed. Manipulation wasn't just her talent, it was her survival tactic, and she wielded it with grace so smooth that even my parents barely noticed. Or maybe they did notice and chose to look away. My father was a man of few words, and even fewer emotions. Stoic, commanding, always carrying the weight of legacy on his shoulders. I can count on one hand the times he hugged me. Praise? That was rarer still. He believed in discipline, in appearances, in strength. To him, feelings were a sign of weakness, and affection was something implied, not spoken. But implication only works if both sides can feel it. I never did. My mother, on the other hand, had softness in her eyes, but it was buried beneath layers of duty. She stood by my father, not always because she agreed, but because she feared rocking the boat. She would pat my hand when no one was looking, slip me extra bread at dinner, but when my sister preened for attention, my mother smiled along with everyone else. Her silence became another kind of wound, one that said, I see you suffering, but I won't stop it. And then there were the allies, the rare sparks of light in a dim environment. My godfather, who also happened to be the family's trusted lawyer, always treated me with respect. He saw through the games, and though he rarely interfered, I could tell he remembered the small ways I was overlooked. And my aunt, sharp-tongued, unafraid, with a laugh that could cut through the estate's cold walls, she was the only one bold enough to call out favoritism when she saw it. You spoil one and starve the other, she once told my parents, right in front of me. Of course, they brushed her off, but in that moment, I felt seen. But most days, the humiliation stacked higher than the ceilings. I ate dinners alone while my sister hosted friends in the grand dining hall. My achievements, top grades, hard-earned scholarships, were dismissed as expected. Meanwhile, my sister was praised for learning a new dance step or wearing a new dress. Guests were invited to celebrate her smallest milestones, while my victories were folded into the background, forgotten before the evening ended. Each slight was small, almost invisible to outsiders, but together they created a silent storm inside me. A storm I tried to contain. For years, I told myself it was just unfair favoritism, a pattern I had to endure. But what I didn't know was that this favoritism was more than just an emotional burden, it was about to become dangerous. Patterns of cruelty rarely come all at once. They arrive quietly, in pieces, until they weave themselves into the very fabric of your life. My family's injustice toward me was not one loud betrayal, but 1,000 smaller ones, each one sharper than the last, each one reminding me that my place in their story was always meant to be written in faint ink. When it came time for college, I was filled with hope. I had worked tirelessly through high school, earning grades and recognition that could have opened doors to anywhere. I dreamed of studying abroad, immersing myself in a world beyond the estate's walls. And yet, when I received my acceptance letter, the celebration I had longed for never came. My father merely nodded and said, "We'll cover part of it." Part of it. The rest, I would have to scrape together myself through loans and late-night jobs. I swallowed my disappointment, thinking at least I was given something. That illusion shattered months later when my sister announced she had been accepted to a luxury program overseas. Not only did my parents pay every cent of her tuition, they also furnished her with an apartment, a car, and a generous allowance to enjoy life abroad. My achievements were met with silence, hers were met with applause. I thought I could endure it, until the breaking point came. Holidays became another cruel reminder of my role as the forgotten daughter. Every Christmas morning, boxes wrapped in shimmering paper with my sister's name piled high under the tree, gold necklaces, designer handbags, even vacations tucked inside envelopes. When it was my turn, I unwrapped practical things, a pair of socks, a plain sweater, sometimes a book I hadn't asked for. I smiled politely, told myself it didn't matter, and pushed the sting deep inside. But watching my sister parade around with her sparkling jewels while I folded away my sensible gifts felt like watching a stage play where I was cast as the extra in my own family story. I thought I could endure it, until the breaking point came. The cruelest cuts, however, came not in what was given, but in what was withheld, approval. I spent years building myself into someone worthy of pride, scholarships, promotions, community service, but none of it seemed to matter at home. If my sister cooked a single meal, she was praised as resourceful. If she attended a charity gala, she was hailed as generous. Meanwhile, my milestones were brushed aside, barely noticed. Once, when I won an award at work, I gathered the courage to share the news at dinner. My father glanced up only to say, "That's good," before turning back to ask my sister about her weekend plans. That dismissal stung more than any insult could. My efforts were invisible, erased before they even left my lips. I thought I could endure it, until the breaking point came. Each slight was another stone stacked on my chest, and yet I convinced myself to keep going. I told myself endurance was strength, that silence was noble, that someday they might see me for who I was. But what I didn't understand then was that a pattern of mistreatment doesn't fade on its own, it escalates. And when the cracks finally spread wide enough, when the weight of all those injustices became too heavy to carry, the breaking point wasn't just inevitable. It was imminent. Death has a way of pulling families together, or tearing them apart. When my father passed, the estate filled with mourners dressed in black, the air heavy with incense and whispered condolences. I had prepared myself for grief, for the hollow ache of loss, but I hadn't prepared myself for what followed, the cruel theater of favoritism that played out even at his funeral. My children, dressed neatly, sat quietly at the back, clutching my hands, looking for comfort in a place where comfort was scarce. No one noticed them. No one offered them a kind word or even a plate of food. They were invisible, just as I had been my whole life. Meanwhile, my sister swept through the room like royalty, her hand on the shoulders of my father's closest friends, her voice echoing with practiced sorrow. People gathered around her, praising her strength, consoling her as though she were the only child who had lost a parent. I stood at the edges, watching my children shrink further into their seats, their eyes downcast, while their cousins ran freely, fed and celebrated. The cruelty wasn't in what was said, it was in what was denied. And then came the will reading. We gathered in my father's study, the mahogany walls pressing in on us, the chandelier casting shadows that seemed to move with every breath. The lawyer opened the folder slowly, his fingers deliberate, as though each page carried a weight he understood but we did not. My sister sat tall, her smile barely hidden, as though she already knew what was coming. I tried to steady myself, to prepare for whatever truth was about to be revealed. That was when she leaned in. Her perfume, sharp and overpowering, invaded my space. Her lips barely parted, but the words that slipped out were venomous enough to paralyze me. "You were never the daughter he loved." The air in the room fractured. My heart slammed against my chest, the sound filling my ears. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, as though the room itself had recoiled from her cruelty. The lawyer froze mid-sentence, his voice trailing off into an uneasy silence. Papers trembled slightly in his hand, and even he looked as if he had been struck by the weight of her words. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but nothing came. My throat was tight, my body heavy. Every humiliation of the past, every forgotten birthday, every dismissed achievement, every holiday spent in shadows, collapsed into that single moment. It was as though my entire life had been condensed into her whisper, and all of it declared worthless. Around me, the silence grew unbearable. Chairs creaked as relatives shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us, pretending not to hear what they could not unhear. My mother lowered her gaze, offering no comfort. My children's small fingers squeezed mine, but they said nothing. The world seemed to have stopped, and I was left sitting in the stillness of betrayal. But here's the thing about venom, it poisons not just the victim, but the one who delivers it. My sister believed her words would diminish me, that they would cement her place as the beloved child once and for all. What she didn't realize was that in that exact moment, her arrogance, her cruelty, her unmasked disdain would ignite a chain of events she could never control. The lawyer cleared his throat, hesitating as he glanced at me before continuing. And in that pause, in that breathless silence, something shifted inside me. The pain was still raw, but beneath it, something else stirred, an ember of clarity that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. The breaking point had finally arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. There are moments in life when silence is no longer survival, it becomes surrender. And as I sat in that suffocating study, my sister's words still ringing like venom in my ears, I realized I had been surrendering my entire life. Every ignored achievement, every forgotten celebration, every moment I swallowed my pain just to keep peace, it had all been a form of surrender. But that whisper, "You were never the daughter he loved," was different. It wasn't favoritism anymore. It wasn't subtle neglect. It was open rejection, sharp enough to slice through the last fragile thread of patience I had been clinging to. For a few agonizing seconds, I felt the weight of it crush me. My heart pounded, my throat tightened, and my body threatened to fold into the very shadows I had lived in since childhood. I thought of my children, sitting quietly at the back of that room, watching me, learning from me. What would they see if I let myself crumble? That being silent in the face of cruelty was acceptable? That being treated as less was something to endure, not challenge? No. I could not let them inherit that lesson. It was then that the pain twisted into something else, resolve. It didn't happen with fireworks or shouting. It happened quietly, deep inside, like steel being forged in fire. The tears that threatened to spill hardened into clarity. My pulse steadied, my back straightened, and for the first time in my life, I understood that I wasn't weak for being overlooked, I was strong for surviving it. And now, survival wasn't enough. I needed to rise. I turned my head toward my sister. Her smug smile lingered, convinced she had broken me for good. And that's when the words came, steady, clear, and louder than I had ever dared to speak in that house. "No, you're wrong. And today, the truth will speak louder than you ever could." The room stilled. My voice wasn't raised, but it carried, echoing against the walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had likely never imagined a daughter like me finding her voice here, in this moment. My sister blinked, startled. For once, she wasn't in control. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the power that had shifted in the room. My mother's head lifted just slightly, as if even she couldn't deny that something had changed. And my children, their hands tightened around each other's, eyes wide, not with fear, but with pride. That was my mic drop moment. Years of silence condensed into one line that tore through the layers of cruelty and favoritism. And in saying it, I felt something lift off me, like I had finally stepped out of a cage I hadn't realized I was still inside. But this wasn't just about defiance. It was about reclaiming my story. I had let others write it for me for far too long, casting me as the afterthought, the shadow. No more. From that moment on, every word, every revelation, every twist of truth would not be dictated by my sister's venom or my parents' neglect. It would be dictated by me, by my strength, by the justice that was finally about to unfold. What I didn't know then was that my single line of defiance would not just silence her, it would unravel everything she had built her identity on. Because when the truth finally speaks, it doesn't whisper. It roars. The study felt like a battlefield, though no one raised a weapon. The silence was sharper than steel, the air heavy with unsaid words, and the eyes of every relative fixed on me as if waiting for me to retreat, to sink back into the quiet shadow where I had always been kept. But I did not retreat. For once in my life, I refused to bow down. I cleared my throat, steady though my hands trembled beneath the table. "I want the will read in full," I said, my voice carrying a calm firmness that surprised even me. My sister laughed, an ugly, condescending laugh that rippled through the room like poison. She tilted her head and smirked, as if to say, "Here she goes again, trying to play important. But this time, I didn't flinch. The lawyer hesitated, his fingers brushing over the papers before him. There are certain clauses your father left behind, he began cautiously. The room stirred, whispers rose and fell like waves crashing against the walls. My sister leaned back in her chair, folding her arms with a look of disdain. Clauses, she scoffed. Please. We all know how this ends. Don't waste our time entertaining her. But the lawyer did not look at her. He looked at me. And then, with deliberate care, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a smaller sealed envelope, aged paper, my father's handwriting scrawled across the front. My stomach tightened. For the first time, I felt his presence in the room, as though he had anticipated this very moment. Your father left specific instructions, the lawyer said, his voice firm now. Instructions that were not to be revealed until today. He broke the seal, the sound like thunder in the silence, and unfolded the letter. My sister rolled her eyes, tapping her manicured nails on the polished wood, her mockery filling the air. This is ridiculous, she muttered. He loved me. Everyone knows that. She's nothing but the backup plan, the mistake. Her words might once have shattered me. But in that moment, they bounced off like arrows against armor. I sat straighter, eyes locked on the letter, refusing to let her poison derail me. The lawyer began to read, his voice steady but heavy with significance. To my daughters, if you are hearing this, I am gone. And if the past repeats itself, one of you will try to silence the other. His gaze lifted briefly, resting on my sister before returning to the page. This will cannot be interpreted on pride or assumption alone. What is written here is final. Gasps echoed in the room. My sister's mocking smile faltered for the first time, her mask of confidence slipping as her eyes darted nervously toward the letter. I turned to her then, my voice clear and unwavering. You said I was never the daughter he loved. But today, we'll let his truth, not your lies, decide that. The payoff was not in the letter alone, but in that moment, when I stood toe-to-toe with her mockery and refused to bow down. For years, she had thrived on my silence, fed on my endurance. But now, the balance shifted. Now, it was her laughter that rang hollow, her scoffs that sounded desperate. What the lawyer was about to reveal would change everything, but the true victory had already begun. For the first time, I wasn't the overlooked daughter. I was the one holding the line, and I wasn't moving. Not anymore. The lawyer's voice cut through the thick silence, each word like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples across the room. According to your father's final will, the majority of the estate, including the property, assets, and business holdings, will pass to his elder daughter. He paused deliberately, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. My heart thudded, bracing for the predictable ending. But then his voice sharpened, with one condition. That she maintains the family legacy responsibly, with integrity and financial prudence. Failure to do so would result in the inheritance transferring in its entirety to his younger daughter. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the scrape of chairs against the floor. My sister's eyes widened, her mask of superiority cracking into disbelief. What? She hissed, half rising from her chair. That's absurd. He trusted me. Everyone knows I was the one he relied on. But even as she protested, her voice trembled. The lawyer calmly laid down another document, a set of records meticulously preserved. Your father was not blind. He left instructions for a full audit of your financial behavior. It is all here. His finger tapped the papers. And it is damning. My godfather leaned forward, his voice unflinching. She drained accounts meant for your father's medical care. She borrowed against properties he never approved. And she covered it up with forged signatures. His words landed like blows, steady and undeniable. The color drained from my sister's face. That's a lie, she shrieked, her hands slamming against the table. But before she could spin her web of excuses, my aunt's laughter, sharp, cutting, filled the room. Oh, child. You've been playing queen for years, but the crown you wore was nothing but stolen brass. She leaned in, her tone scalding. You manipulated your own father in his weakest hours, feeding on his illness to secure your own comfort. And now? The truth is here, and it will choke you. Whispers filled the air, heavy with scandal. Relatives who once praised my sister now recoiled, their eyes darting away from her as if her betrayal might stain them too. The cousins she flaunted gifts to avoided her gaze, embarrassed by the truth that their golden idol had been nothing more than a fraud. I sat silently, watching it unravel. My whole life I had waited for someone to see me, for the truth to be visible. And now, without me raising my voice, the truth thundered across the room. My father had known more than he ever let on. He had seen through the carefully constructed lies. He had left a legacy, yes, but also a test. And my sister had failed it spectacularly. Her protests grew weaker, her hands trembling as she shuffled through the papers she couldn't refute. It's not what it looks like, she muttered, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of reality crashing around her. For once, I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to fight for my place at the table. The facts, the testimonies, the undeniable evidence, all of it spoke louder than she ever could. And as I looked around the room, I realized something powerful. Justice doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in quiet papers, sealed letters, and voices of allies who finally speak the truth. My sister had built her empire on deception. But in the end, that empire collapsed under the weight of her own choices. And all I had to do was sit still, watch, and let karma do its work. Karma does not always strike like lightning, it seeps in slowly, dismantling arrogance piece by piece, until the once powerful stand exposed with nothing left to cling to. That's exactly what happened to my sister after the truth surfaced in that suffocating study. Her fall wasn't a single collapse. It was a series of humiliations that stripped her of everything she had once weaponized against me. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. Her closest friends, the ones who used to orbit her like moths around a flame, began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. The people who once celebrated her extravagant lifestyle wanted nothing to do with the whispers of debt and manipulation now attached to her name. The glamorous circle she had so carefully built dissolved overnight, and with each absence, her desperation grew clearer. Then came the financial unraveling. Those luxury cars she flaunted, the sparkling jewels she flashed at every family gathering, even the penthouse apartments she bragged about, it all came under scrutiny. One by one, assets she couldn't truly afford were repossessed, seized, or quietly sold off. The woman who once ridiculed me for living simply was now being stripped down to basics, the very life she had mocked me for enduring. And the cruelest part? It wasn't anyone else's doing. It was her own greed and lies finally catching up to her. But perhaps the most brutal blow was public embarrassment. Our extended family, once enthralled by her charm, began to speak openly of her downfall. Whispers carried through gatherings, her name followed by words like fraud, debt, and scandal. The same relatives who used to compare me unfavorably to her now shook their heads in pity or disgust. She could no longer walk into a room and command it with a smile. Every glance she received was laced with judgment, every silence filled with unspoken condemnation. The pedestal she had stood on for decades was shattered, and the shards cut only her. And in that same moment, my own story shifted. Relatives who had once overlooked me began to approach me with sincerity. Some offered apologies, subtle but heartfelt, "We didn't see how much you carried." Others offered support, words of encouragement that filled gaps I hadn't realized were still aching. For the first time, I felt what it meant to be seen, not as a shadow, but as someone who had endured and emerged stronger. The emotional vindication was deeper than words. It wasn't about wealth or inheritance, it was about finally knowing that my years of quiet sacrifice were not wasted. My children, who had watched me endure dismissal after dismissal, now saw me stand tall. They saw that resilience had meaning, that truth eventually triumphs, that no matter how long someone plays the golden role, karma does not forget. The contrast between us couldn't have been sharper. My sister, once radiant, adored, untouchable, was crumbling under the weight of her own choices. I, once ignored, dismissed, invisible, was finally standing in the light. The very dynamic that had defined our entire lives was reversed in front of everyone. She lost the illusion of power, and I gained the one thing she never truly had, respect. That was the essence of karma, not revenge delivered by my hands, but justice delivered by time, truth, and consequence. And as I watched her stumble while I found my footing, I realized that the sweetest victories are not the ones we chase, they're the ones that come when we stand firm long enough for the truth to reveal itself. When the storm had passed and the dust of my sister's downfall finally settled, I was left with something I had never expected, not just the estate, but a chance to rewrite the story of our family's legacy. For so long, I had lived under the weight of being unseen, dismissed, diminished. Now, the responsibility was mine. But instead of wielding it with the arrogance my sister had once shown, I chose something different. I chose humility. Securing the estate wasn't about wealth for me. It wasn't about finally having the upper hand or flaunting victory. It was about fairness. For my children, it meant stability, security, and a chance to grow up free of the cruelty I had endured. I made sure they never had to wonder if they were loved or worthy. Every meal shared at our table, every celebration in our home, was equal, no one favored, no one forgotten. In giving them that balance, I was healing the wounds left inside me, the scars of a childhood where love had always been conditional. But healing didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like watching a wound knit itself back together after years of neglect. For the first time in decades, I stood in front of the mirror and didn't see the shadow my sister had forced me into. I saw a woman who had survived dismissal after dismissal, who had raised her children with quiet dignity, who had endured long enough for truth to speak. I saw myself as worthy, not because of the estate, not because of anyone's approval, but because I had finally stopped measuring my value through someone else's eyes. And I was not alone anymore. My godfather, who had always respected me in silence, became a trusted advisor and a steady hand as I navigated my new responsibilities. My aunt, fiery and unafraid, remained by my side, reminding me with her sharp humor that strength doesn't need permission. Together, they formed a circle of support I never thought I would have, people who didn't just tolerate me, but uplifted me. Beyond them, even relatives who had once overlooked me began to step closer, offering genuine connection instead of empty pleasantries. Slowly, a new family began to take shape, one chosen by respect rather than bloodlines. Most of all, my children began to thrive. No longer forced to sit in the shadows of their cousins, they bloomed in an environment where their voices mattered, their efforts were celebrated, and their worth was never questioned. Their laughter filled the halls that had once echoed with silence. Their drawings replaced the cold portraits of ancestors, their joy softened the sharp edges of a house that had once felt like a museum. Watching them run freely through rooms that had suffocated me as a child was its own form of redemption. The transformation wasn't just external, it was deeply internal. I no longer carried the ache of invisibility. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to people who refused to see me. Instead, I had learned that worth is not given, it is claimed. And once you claim it, no one can take it away. For the first time, the estate no longer felt like a prison of expectations. It felt like a home. Not because of its wealth or grandeur, but because it was filled with love, fairness, and the kind of peace that comes only after surviving storms. And in choosing to build that peace, I realized that I had inherited something far more valuable than money or property. I had inherited freedom, the freedom to create a legacy built not on favoritism or cruelty, but on love and dignity. It is a strange thing, how quickly the tides of power can turn. For years, my sister stood untouchable, her words sharp, her influence heavy, her arrogance unmatched. But when the veil of lies lifted, when karma finally carved away her illusions, she found herself stripped bare. Still, even in ruin, she tried to return to the one role she had mastered, manipulation. It happened quietly at first. A phone call late one night, her voice trembling with the kind of fragility she had never shown before. "I just need one more chance," she whispered. "You don't understand how hard this has been for me. We're sisters. Blood should matter more than mistakes. The same woman who once told me I was never loved now tried to cloak her desperation in the language of family. I listened, not with the ache of the overlooked child I once was, but with the clarity of someone who had finally stepped into her own strength. Her words dripped with the same tactics she had used for years: guilt, pity, entitlement. Once, I might have folded under the weight of them. Once, I might have agreed just to keep the peace, to avoid being cast as the ungrateful one. But not anymore. When we met in person, her facade cracked even further. Her clothes no longer screamed luxury, her jewelry was gone, and the confidence that had once filled every room was replaced with restless eyes that couldn't hold my gaze. She reached across the table, her hands trembling, her voice breaking. "Please, help me. Just this once. You have everything now. Don't let me drown." For a moment, the younger version of me, the girl who longed for her sister's approval, who wanted any scrap of kindness, stirred inside. But then I remembered every slight, every humiliation, every time she basked in the glow of favoritism while I was left in the dark. I remembered her whisper at the will reading, cruel and deliberate, "You were never the daughter he loved." And I knew what had to be said. I leaned back, my voice calm but firm, my words unshakable. "I'll help you survive, but respect comes first, or nothing at all." The silence that followed was different from the silences of our past. It wasn't heavy with shame or dismissal, it was heavy with finality. For the first time, I was no longer begging for space in her world. She was standing in mine, and she realized it. Her lips parted as if to argue, to bargain again, but she stopped. She saw that the old game no longer worked, that I had drawn a boundary she could not cross. The shift was undeniable. The sister who once held every advantage was now reduced to pleading, and the daughter who had once been invisible now commanded the terms. Power had changed hands, but more importantly, dignity had been restored. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching her sit there, stripped of her manipulations, was not about revenge, it was about closure. And for the first time, I understood that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. It was love for myself, and protection for the family I was now responsible for. In that moment, the audience of relatives, allies, and even my children witnessed something profound, the end of an old cycle. The golden sister had crumbled, and the shadow had stepped into the light. The reckoning wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, decisive, and unshakable. And sometimes, that is the most powerful kind of justice. The house that once felt like a museum of shadows now felt different. The portraits on the wall still watched with their stern faces, but I no longer felt judged by them. I felt free. As I walked through the halls, I realized that the greatest shift wasn't in the estate itself, but in me. For the first time, I could say with certainty, the truth didn't just rewrite the will, it rewrote my worth. I had carried the label of lesser for so long that it had embedded itself into my bones. Every dismissal, every slight, every whisper that I was unworthy had formed the script of my life. But when the truth finally surfaced, through my father's letter, through the exposure of my sister's lies, it did more than settle inheritance. It shattered that script entirely. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a woman who had endured, risen, and claimed her rightful place without losing herself in bitterness. The most powerful validation came not from extended relatives, not even from the allies who had stood by me, but from my children. One evening, as we sat together at the kitchen table, my son looked at me with eyes wide and steady. "We're proud of you," he said softly. My daughter nodded, her small hand slipping into mine. "You never gave up, Mom." Their words melted the last remnants of doubt I had carried. Because if I had done nothing else in this world, I had shown my children that resilience is not weakness, it is strength. That even when you are overlooked, your worth does not diminish. It waits, steady, until you are ready to claim it. As for my sister, the transformation was stark. The woman who once commanded every room now slipped into irrelevance. Her name, once praised, became a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. She lingered at the edges of gatherings, no longer admired but pitted. And the truth is, I didn't need her downfall to feel complete. Her irrelevance wasn't my victory, it was simply the natural consequence of a life built on arrogance and lies. The victory was in my own healing. In the laughter of my children filling the estate that had once echoed with silence. In the respect I now carried, not because of wealth, but because I finally respected myself. In the circle of allies who reminded me that strength doesn't always roar, sometimes, it simply endures until it can finally stand tall. The story was no longer about a will. It was about reclaiming dignity, about turning pain into power, about teaching the next generation that worth is not something others grant, it's something you own. And as I closed the chapter on years of shadows, I understood the truest form of justice, not revenge, not triumph over another, but peace within yourself. Sometimes in life, the most painful words are not the ones shouted in anger, but the ones whispered in cruelty. My sister thought her venom, "You were never the daughter he loved," would break me forever. But instead, it became the turning point. Because sometimes the cruelest words don't bury you. They unlock the strength you didn't realize was waiting inside. And sometimes, karma doesn't whisper quietly in the background, it roars, loud enough for the whole court to hear. This story isn't just about inheritance. It's about worth, dignity, and the power of refusing to stay silent when you've been treated as less. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, let my story remind you of this. Your value doesn't shrink just because someone else refuses to see it. The truth always finds its way to the surface, and when it does, it has the power to rewrite everything you thought you lost. That is why I share these tales. Not for revenge, not for bitterness, but to remind anyone listening that justice comes, even if it takes time. And when it does, it doesn't just balance the scales, it restores the pieces of you that you thought were gone forever. Now, before we close, I want to ask you something important. Hit that hype button right below this video. Think of it as more than a like, it's a super like, and you only get 3 each week. Using one here helps push this story higher so more people can see it, more people can feel the same rush of justice, and more people can be reminded that karma never sleeps. And of course, tap like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss the next epic karma tale. Because the next story? It's filled with even darker betrayals, and an ending no one saw coming. And trust me, you won't want to miss the roar of karma when it finally strikes again.